Welcome back to Diaspora's Media. So good to be back. We are building off of the previous discussion, which is Diaspora Wars are a Psy-Op Part 1. Please go check that out if you haven't yet checked it out. This is a series that we're going to be building upon for these next couple of weeks, just like Ask the Professor, where it was a series that was built upon the previous episode. Each episode can be watched as a standalone, but I do recommend that you go check them out in succession. So today, as far as what we were discussing last time we were actually talking about tribal antagonism, right? And we're going to continue talking about tribal antagonism. But first, we have to contextualize this conversation. We fail to contextualize a lot of conversations, and the devil is in details, right? So context matters a whole lot. I also think it's quite important to look at the iterations that white supremacy continued to improve upon. And so that's something that we're going to discuss today as we dive into how we can walk towards Black unity, right? Especially because the only thing that is common among us is the fact that we all have the same skin color. In addition to the other aspect, which I'm going to talk to about shortly. Actually, screw it, I'll introduce it right now. Frank Zanou, who is a topic of discussion because Frank Zanou stated a lot of different things about the Black community in America. But one thing he stated, and I'm going to be reading some notes that I took down here in a second. One thing he stated was that Blacks across the world can't unite just because we are the same skin color. And again, I'm paraphrasing here. I'll get the direct quote for you later. But that is actually true, right? But only under normal circumstances. And so this is something that I wrote when I was taking my notes. I wrote, Europeans are not ethnically homogeneous just because they're all white. Africans are also not ethnically homogeneous just because we are all Black. Frank Zanou, under normal circumstances, would be correct in saying that people cannot unite simply based on race. But these times especially are not normal circumstances. In the modern era, we see different whites of various European national and ethnic groups united by their whiteness. Seldom in America does the ethnicity of a white person matter more than their whiteness and citizenship to the nation. Prioritizing whiteness and American nationality is integral to ensuring the power structures in America. That's something that I think needs to be examined, right? I think that the problem with examining the behavior of other nations and other groups of people is that we fail to acknowledge when something works, when something makes sense to do, right? We fail to acknowledge these things just because they may come from a group that we don't necessarily like, agree with, etc., right? But to begin this case study, and again, my point is this: we have to unite on race now because we have no choice, and because we are being exterminated based on race. They're not looking at Blacks in Kenya for just because that's where I'm from, and they're like, "Oh, you're Congo. We're not going to kill you. We like Congos." Or, oh, they're not going to look at South Africans and be like, "Oh, you're Zulu. We're not going to kill you. We like Zulus." No. The white supremacist power structure wants Black people away and done with, disenfranchised, etc., in many different varying degrees to many extents, and they don't care about our ethnicities. They don't care about our subdivisions of Blackness that may be more palatable to them. That's a level of respectability politics, right? It's not true. And so that's something that I would like to dive into today. So my first point is this. Whites were not always united either, right? And most of the time they're not. However, in certain circumstances, they definitely are. So the first thing I think we need to look at is how white tribal antagonism, how European tribal antagonism manifested itself in the past, specifically with the conquering of the Americas, and how similar this is to the conquering of continent of Africa. And I don't think we juxtapose these things enough, right? So when America was being conquered, many European nations knew what they wanted out of it, right? They knew they wanted land, right? They knew that, they were looking for resources. They were coming to find territory that they could take for themselves, that they could use for their empires, right? And they were successful in doing so. But this didn't begin with a ton of tumultuous, complex relationships, right? You had all of these Native American tribes, and these Native American tribes had their own relationships, their own issues with each other, their own ways of life, their own systems, their own communications, their own religions, etc. But all of these various tribes, right, were an immense amount to conquer. They also had their own issues that could be exploited, right, by the Europeans. But this was a very sloppy conquest. You had the French fighting the British fighting the Spanish, right? You had Iroquois, you had honestly, there were thousands. I'm about to pull up those maps in a second. I know you can see some of them right now, but this is why it became known as the Wild Wild West, was because alliances were complicated, land ownership was complicated, marriage and families were complicated, right? This was the complication that created the complex structure of America that is not homogeneous, and has so many racial implications behind it, so much racial context behind it. But seldom do we see the comparison between the Aboriginal nations of American communities and the Aboriginal nations of African communities, right? It's actually pretty similar, right? It's actually pretty similar. But the conquest of the Americas was super sloppy and it was super difficult. It took hundreds of years to manifest destiny, right? It took a lot of time to actually wipe out the Native Americans, both purposefully and on accident, right? Like, it took a lot of time to indoctrinate, to give a level of religion that was in favor of the teachings of the European power structure. It took a lot of time to do this, and it was a big learning experience for them, right? This learning experience informed how they continued their conquest afterwards. And I think that's something that we need to look at when we discuss Black unity. Black unity is not a necessity, or it isn't a possibility that just comes about without having an external circumstance from the environment that, forces us to have to do this, any more than white unity was, right? Like, the Europeans fought against each other no matter what. Violence is a proximity game. As we became globalized, right, especially as white supremacy went through its iterations, which we're going to go through right now, specifically as we look at the colonization of the Americas and the colonization of Africa. That was an iteration, and there were things that were improved upon. So I think that it's important for us to actually take a look at those things, right? So here you see the land disputes with other Europeans, right? That was Britain, that was France, that was the Netherlands, even some of Russia, right? These land disputes. And the alliances with some Native American tribes, right? The Aboriginal tribes taught these settlers how to survive. They taught them how to actually live, how to navigate the land, right? These things they didn't learn for free. There were actual treaties that were created, that were violated, right? There were actual relationships, some even intermarriage, right, that occurred, right, to cause some of this knowledge transfer that armed them to be able to actually conquer the Americas, right? Same thing with the Aboriginal tribes. The Aboriginal tribes were not all hunky-dory. Some of them had real issues with each other that spanned back for a long time. And these weren't issues that Europeans caused. They were simply issues Europeans exacerbated. And all of this, to sum it up, it just amalgamated into this messy conquering, right? Sloppy conquest of the Americas that resulted in the death of hundreds of millions of people. It resulted in the enslavement of a lot of people. And it resulted in a lot of mistakes that they had to remedy that were unintended consequences. So let's dive into some of these similarities between the conquest of America and the conquest of Africa. Let's actually see if we can zoom in a little bit, right? So here, both Africa and America had some really interesting things, right? They both wanted, Europe wanted both continents for themselves, right? But they had the added benefit when conquering Africa of the knowledge that they gained from conquering the Americas. But before we get into the added benefit of the knowledge, let's dive into some of these similarities, right? So what are these similarities? Multiple European nations sought control over, right? Over both of them. The conquest involved violence, iconoclasm, brainwashing, right? They took the children, put them in boarding schools, in honestly missionary-based boarding schools. They made sure to change their faith. They made sure to change the youth minds, right, on the warrior classes that were trying to protect them and free them. Same thing they did in Africa. Like, for example, the Mau Mau are considered a rebel group, not their freedom fighting group, right? But everyone would consider in America George Washington to be a hero, right? There were cultural commonalities, right? Customs that, varied regionally because of how vast some of this land was and how vast the ethnic differences between these people were, right? Both continents, again, like we said, both continents had tons of landmass. North America, South America, that's a lot of landmass, right? Africa in general, I know the maps are manipulated, so you can't actually see the scale, but America can fit just in the Sahara Desert, right? So, and that's pretty much uninhabitable, right? They both had immense amounts of diverse ethnic groups. And these ethnic groups were spanning the entire continent. Some of them never even spoke to each other. So even if they didn't have issues with each other, they never had a reason to unite because they didn't have any proximity to each other. Europe is quite small, right? So yeah, especially in comparison to a continent like Africa or continents like North America and South America, Europe is quite small. So some of the ethnic differences between Europeans in Europe are exacerbated because of the land, right? They also share similarities in language, right? Despite regional differences. In North America, there were some Native American tribes that could communicate with other tribes just because of the language family similarities, just like in Africa, where certain Bantu languages, even though you might be separated by nation states, you have very distinct similarities that can help you understand their languages, right? Or even their customs, right? Shout out to the Bantu. So this is something that is already a prerequisite to understanding this context. But when we look at these similarities in conquest, the landmass was enormous. The groups of people were ethnically diverse and covered a large span, right? They also were, in comparison to the Europeans, quite primitive in their weaponry and in their defense. So there was a lot of things that were very similar. Now, the thing is Europe's learning curve and European conquest learning curve was phenomenally high in comparison to the indigenous learning curve. Very few indigenous tribes decided that the industrial age was something they needed to participate in stat if they were going to survive, right? That's just like Japan. The Japanese saw they were going to be destroyed by the industrial age if they did not embrace the industrial age, much like how agrarian societies destroyed hunter-gatherer societies. I think it was the Neolithic period, right? But after we left, the hunter-gatherer societies, they were completely destroyed by agrarian societies. Agrarian societies were completely destroyed by warrior societies, like the Greeks, right? And then you have the industrial age and what the industrial age did to the rest of the world, right? And I may be conflating some of these things. I'll be sure to bring more accurate information, but the gist is that when you come across a primitive society, especially technologically, right, you have this notion that it will be it will be conquered entirely, and that is something that is logically sound, right? So let's take a look at this landscape. These are the indigenous nations, and some of these indigenous nations, this is a lot of people, right? This is a lot of people. This is a lot of ethnic groups. They're listed down here, right, in alphabetical order. This is a decent bit, and this is just North America, right? This is just North America, modern day USA and Canada, and Mexico, right, and Central America. So we get in a little bit of Central America. We got the islands right here. This doesn't even include South America, which had a myriad of diverse ethnic groups, just like Africa. So we're seeing this diversity of ethnic groups. Why would all of these ethnic groups have an incentive to all unite based on the race of being Native American, right? Like, they wouldn't have that incentive. They had enough space, they had enough land, they had enough resources prior to the conquest of the Europeans to be able to exist in their own ethnic groups and it be enough for them, right? They didn't have an incentive. And so that's where one of the things that I want to address what Frank Zanu said is that, yes, unity was not based on race because it didn't have to be. But we are now in an era where it has to be, right? We have to unite based on race just because we're being exterminated based on race, right? Just like how with Europe, the Spaniards, they didn't consider themselves one with the British, just like the Irish didn't consider themselves one with Great Britain, right? Just because they were white. They had different things that separated them ethnically, from language to customs to so many things, right? And obviously there's some overlapping layers, just like the Nilots and the Bantu, right? There's some overlaps, there's some intermarrying, there's cultural transfer that occurs with migration patterns for herds, etc. But for the most part, uniting based on race wasn't even something white people did. So Frank Zanu is entirely correct on that, right? However, this changes later on during European conquest. So let's look at Africa. Africa is a big map, right? Ethnically diverse, just like we looked at Native America, right? Ancient America, quite diverse. Africa, even more, right? But you see this motif of a large landmass and this large landmass must be taken control over, right? But the thing is the conquering of Africa was way more thought about, and it was way more flushed out. And you could tell that the iteration of white supremacy was significantly more flushed out, right? So let's actually dive into that, right? But as you can see, look at how diverse this is, right? So even though it was conquered, and we have all of these diverse ethnic groups, diverse tribes that we're trying to, just jumble up in one now as a singular race. This wasn't how it ever was. Nation states weren't something that were developed by borders, that were drawn by other people. These nation states were created through hundreds of thousands of years of inhabitation of lands, as well as even some specific adaptations that occurred. Like, for example, the Kalenjin live in a completely different region as the Kamba. They have different adaptations. You're not going to see a Kamba runner winning the Olympics because they didn't have those regional adaptations, just like Nilots. Nilots have regional adaptations. So a lot of these borders, they weren't drawn by nation states. Nation states are relatively new concepts, right? But so is racial unity, right? Racial identification. And identification is very serious for tribal antagonism. Racial identification these are new concepts. So Frank Zanou is not wrong when he says we did not unite based on race. But I do think, much like how white supremacy saw its flaws, right, during its European imperialist conquest, I think it's time for us to look at our own flaws and see exactly where we are going wrong, particularly with unity. So let's dive into that, right? I'm under not only the impression, but I believe I have evidence, at least a few points, to show that white supremacy learned what it needed to from conquering the Americas and use this information properly to actually know how to unite commonly, right? Yes, I might be German, or you might be Swiss, or you might be British, you might be what was the other, French, right? And we might have our issues when we're in Europe, but let those not be exploitable when we enter Africa, when we're conquering Africa. So let's look at some of these mistakes that they learned from, right? So conquering the Americas, they had conflict between European nations, right? That was, the French-Indian War, for example, right? The French versus the British versus Native Americans, and all the complexity within those sides. How did they fix this? Well, the Berlin Conference showed that they fixed that. The Berlin Conference was like, all right, bet we're going to split Africa up, and if you can conquer that, whatever your section is, you control it, right? And we will make sure these things are fair prior to. We will make sure they're fair prior to. And that's why Africa's borders look like absolute squares, right? Like they came up with this already, but this was something they learned because of their conquest of the Americas. So they remedied that with the Berlin Conference. Now each European country is responsible for something. So this was a correction. Instead of fighting each other for all of it, winner takes all, no, they're going to split it prior to, and they're only going to keep their steady flow of resources from their particular territory, right? So that was one thing. And I think that was extremely, extremely smart of them, right? Why was it smart of them? Because now the French are only responsible for maintaining this area, right? They're only responsible for taking from this area, going from this area, teaching language to this area, etc. And they also, still have their labor force, which leads me to point two, right? America was ethnically cleansed, both purposefully and, not on purpose, right? Smallpox, I think, an accident. Once they figured out what it was, I think, you can add in a couple of blankets here and there. But for the most part, a lot of the disease was an accident. The killing was on purpose, but that led them to the issue that, plagued America, which was now they don't have a labor force, right? Now they don't have a labor force. And even though most of the transatlantic slave trade members went to Brazil, right? And that's why Brazil has the largest Black population outside of Africa. But most of the Native Americans that did survive this ethnic cleansing were even though they weren't ethnically cleansed with their lives, they were ethnically cleansed with their classification. So they ended up becoming classified as slave or Negro or Black, right? And so what they did with Africa is they targeted cleansing now, right? They're not going to kill off their entire labor force that they need. They're going to target the warrior class. They're going to target the intelligent. They're going to target any person that can rise to become better and possibly inspire the in-group to actually rebel, right? So they targeted the warriors, they targeted this class, and they knew to implement and to bolster policy that incentivized people they knew were going to trade I'm sorry, that they knew were going to be traitors to their race, right, and to their groups. And so they were very targeted in that. Another thing they learned from American conquest is overt control is too high, right? Especially because the trump card for that, no pun intended, the trump card for that can always be, well, you're not indigenous to this land anyways, right? And so for that, they realized, okay, can't have a white man ruling this nation, can't have a man from a different nation ruling it, but we do need to still control it. So now they control by proxy, right? They control by proxy. These mistakes were really, really grievous, right? But even though it ended up in the America that now can be the clandestine service, even for European countries, this was a lot of bloodshed, a lot of time, and a lot of loss, right? And they needed to minimize that here. So now they control it by proxy. And now you see, even with Burkina Faso, right? The previous president was extradited to back to Burkina Faso from Togo because he was caught trying to destabilize the government yet again, right? So, and he was given millions of dollars to do so. I think his name is Damiba or something. But that general is an example of, again, a proxy leader. Most African leaders are proxy leaders, right? They are leaders that were either educated in the West, and I don't mean went to school in the West. I mean, they were educated and programmed to favor the West, either for money or because of their ideology that we're told. But this is one of the things they learned through their missionary education, et cetera, right? But I think the biggest thing, and this is what we're discussing, is national monarchical priority, right? They were prioritizing nationalism and monarchies and empires rather than whiteness before. Now they prioritize whiteness, right? Now they prioritize whiteness. It's not a matter of if you are British or if you are German or if you are any of these things. Now, white supremacy, and this is one of the downfalls of white supremacy that causes it to eat itself, right, is that white supremacy ends up creating hierarchies even within itself and dehumanizing itself, right? And so that's something that, you know, we can wait for, hopefully. But specifically now, this racial priority becomes more important than anything, where being Mzungu, being white, matters more than being English or being German or being, it just matters if you are white, right? And so I think that that white supremacists and white supremacy ideology really improved its iterations and improved upon its iterations in ways that we genuinely did not do. And I think that that is something that this diaspora discussion can actually lead us to do, right? Is to improve upon our own knowledge. And these iterations, I think it would have really helped us. And I think that's something we should do now, especially as academicians, right? Done with that chart. But as academics, as intellectuals, I think it's important for us to now study and compare and contrast exactly how were we taken, how were we controlled, and how are we still controlled today, right? As a global majority, right? But as nation states who are often weak. And I think this leads to the discussion about Traore in the Sahel, right? The Sahel is a beautiful example of what happens when we fail to, when we remember to, I'm sorry, not fail to, but when we remember that it doesn't matter what our nation state is because those borders weren't even drawn by us. But our unity will be integral to our survival, right? I'm sure there are ethnic groups in West Africa, like there's ethnic groups all over Africa. And I'm sure different nations wanted to maintain their sovereignty, maintain their power, right? Maintain their own respective borders. But what we're seeing Assimi Goïta do, what we're seeing, I believe his name is Abdul Rahman, right? Let me check, make sure I can answer the name right. Mali leader. That would be Assimi Goïta. So I'm talking about Niger. Yeah, Niger. That would be Abdul Rahman Chiani, right? So I knew it was Abdul Rahman, right? So what we're seeing Chiani do, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, what we're seeing Chiani do, what we're seeing Goita do, what we're seeing Traore do, right? This is something that even Kwame Nkrumah said we needed to do stat, right? And this is something we see Europeans do, where they maintain their own borders. Europe maintained its own border, but they still have an EU, and they have open border policies with, you know, citizens who can travel between them, because regardless, they know they're all white, right? And they're all European. Africa needs to do the same thing, right? And so naturally, yes, we can say, okay, we never united based on race, and we never had that thing in common, but it's time for that now, right? It's time for that now. Otherwise, we risk being exterminated based on that. So again, Frank Zanou's logic isn't wrong. It's just applied incorrectly. And that's the problem with, I think, a lot of people who come from one part of the diaspora and move to the other without actually immersing themselves into it, right? Like, and I'm not saying I did that out of my own, you know, knowledge or greatness or pursuit. No, that was just how it happened to be. I happened to be a Kenyan dude who grew up in America, right? So I was immersed in both cultures, but I still know more about American politics than I do Kenyan politics. Why? Because I grew up here, right? And so those things I think are important, but I think it's important to recognize that, yes, white supremacy also did not unite based on race, but they were able to recognize when it's important to, right? No American here is going to be like, oh, I'm German, and you're English, I don't like you, or I'm Irish, you're English, I don't like you. I'm English, you're Polish, I don't like you. That no American is going to do that. No, they're going to be okay with each other just because they are white. This is common sense to them, right? But for some reason, this is not something that's so common sense to us. But I think level setting the conversation is important. And we're going to continue to talk about this a lot more, but I think looking at the iterations of white supremacy and how they came to realize their strategic points that they needed to unify based on a separate identifier than their nation state, based on a separate identifier than their empire, right? They realized that if they were going to maintain this structure that they built that is classified based on race, then they need to do that. And for us to get out of it, we're going to need to unite based on that, right? And that is just one of the laws of war, right? An enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? But that's just what I think. We're going to continue to build on this. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.